First of all, thank you all so much for being here. And hello and welcome to Plants to Plants Hemp Processing Seminars, Episode 6 by Thc Systems. Thc Systems brings industrial extraction and processing technology into the future, and Plants to Plants brings top-tier experts to the table to inform viewers about what it takes to go from concept to completion on a hemp processing plant. Next week, we will be joined by close ally Stephen Fuhr for a very special session about some new concepts we are working towards. And then the following week, for the season 1 finale, we will be talking to the renowned cannabis and hemp lawyer Rod Kite. Please join us for both of those. If you have signed up for season 1, you will get login for those episodes as well. Today's episode is Hemp by the Data, Informed Business Development. In this session, we will dive into the financial metrics because smart business planning starts with the data. Knowing your market, where it is today, and where it is heading is essential to making accurate financial projections. Hemp Benchmarks is a division of New Leaf Data Services and provides what may be the only reliable pricing data reports in the U.S. hemp market. They also have Cannabis Benchmarks, which tracks legal cannabis as well. We are thrilled to be joined by Hemp Benchmarks CFO Ian Laird to take a dive into the data and reveal the biggest opportunities for new and established hemp processing businesses. Ian Laird, CFO of Hemp Benchmarks, Hemp Benchmarks is a leading provider of financial business and industry data for the North American hemp markets. They offer comprehensive and unique benchmark services for public and private organizations and financial institutions. Ian Laird has 35 years of finance experience as a lawyer, investment banker, private equity investor, and entrepreneur. He is currently CFO and general counsel of New Leaf Data Services, LLC, a data analytics company which he co-founded in 2015. From 2009 to 2017, Ian was a co-founder and partner at American Working Capital, a merchant banking firm that provides investment banking services to capital to middle market private companies. From 2007 to 2009, he was the principal of Ukaipa Companies LLC, a multi-billion-dollar investment firm, where he was responsible for sourcing, structuring, and executing private equity investments. Previously, he was a managing director at Duff & Phelps, an international investment banking firm where he focused primarily on middle market M&A and corporate finance. Before we get into this session, I'm very happy to announce that all past episodes of Plants to Plants Hemp Processing Seminars by Thc Systems from this season will be available for rewatch starting tomorrow on our website and on our YouTube. We will be sending out the link to all of you in the morning, and feel free to share these excellent prior sessions covering everything from industrial engineering to facility planning, community collaboration to market forecasting with your colleagues and network. A final reminder to everyone present, and I'll say this a couple times in the chat throughout, to please ask questions. Our guests and hosts will get a chance to answer them at the end of the session. You can do so in the chat module by sending it to the panelists, or you can use the Q&A module located on your screen. You have to hover over the screen and then you can choose that. So now, without further ado, I am very happy to turn things over to our host and to our guest. Our host is Emmett McGregor, CEO of Thc Systems. And here's Ian Laird. Hello. Thank you both very, very much.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Edwin, as always. And thank you, Ian, for being on with us. Really been tracking Hemp Benchmarks for quite a while as pretty much the only valued data set we have for pricing data in the hemp market. Always extremely essential for our clients to stay up to date with pricing metrics. So we are always referring them to your service. Why don't we start off by letting you add a little additional flesh on the bones of what it is your company does, who you are, what the background is. Edwin, maybe Ian, would you like to start with the slides or have a moment to just...
No, you can start with the slides. My background is, as you heard, a conventional finance background. Started exploring the cannabis marketplace in 2014 and launched our Cannabis Benchmarks in 2015. This is our team. I think the most material fact here is that 80% of the team comes from a company called Standard & Poor's Global Platts. Platts is the leading price reporting agency and business intelligence firm for energy and other commodities, and we're bringing the same pricing methodology, discipline, and institutional quality to the cannabis and hemp markets.
Excellent, and that is a key distinction, is really that this is built on the foundation of how financial reporting as far as how market data reporting, pricing information is shared among the common industries in the energy sector, in the food commodity sector. So we're trying to, grow as an industry, and an essential part of that is having a common understanding of what the market actually looks like.
And we, when we started, we understood that we would be bringing price transparency first to the physical market, which is buyers and sellers. But down the road, longer term, we're looking to bring these types of trading tools to the financial markets, where you have, for example, trading a barrel of oil will trade 99 times before someone takes physical delivery. We want hemp farmers to have the same financial tools that are available to farmers of soybean, wheat, corn, etc., and be able to have futures trading, futures contracts that will settle off our index off some of the major commodity exchanges. So that's the direction we're going, and we expect to have futurized hemp contracts within the next 2 years.
Wow. So will that be within the directly attached to the Hemp Benchmarks platform? This will be a
no. We're an independent price reporting agency, so we don't participate in any transactions. We're independent. We don't have a position in the plant, but we'll be working off one of the major exchanges, and we will be the benchmark or index of record that settles trades.
Wow.
So you'll have speculators, investors providing liquidity to the market, and you'll have hemp producers and processors able to sell forward, and all the other financial capabilities that you have with other agricultural commodities.
Great. Well, before we take a step forward into the data, I think it's maybe a good opportunity to talk about how financial, how commodities markets around the world function today, and how hemp actually differs from the way that those markets operate. It's really essential for people to know that right as of today, this is essentially an informal market, that you're seeing purely private transactions, sale of hemp, purchase of hemp on biomass level, on an ingredient level. Everything is essentially a spot buy at the time of sale. And there isn't any public listing service as it is right now that is listing the transactional data and allowing investors that may otherwise provide liquidity to farmers and processors up front in the form of futures purchases. So putting cash up front for future delivery of product, which provides a buffer of liquidity up front for a lot of these producers, both on the agricultural side and the processing side in other industries. We don't have that luxury in the hemp market yet, but this is a rapidly maturing market. So with a service like Hemp Benchmarks showing what could inform some of these transactions, and then moving, as you said, to a public commodities exchange model in the near future, will start to allow these traditional or conventional financial services that really provide a slack in the market and provide some assurances of income to the producers of these commodity goods coming. It sounds like you're confident within the next couple of years.
Yes, really, to have an active futures market, you need up to 3 years of price history to make sure the prices aren't manipulable. There's an organization, IOSCO principles, which govern independent price reporting agencies to make sure that pricing data is not manipulated like you saw the banks do with LIBOR a number of years ago. And you need a $5 billion notional market. We're getting there. We're not there yet. We have over a year of price data, and we're working actively with a couple of exchanges right now to help develop these trading tools. We're working with NASDAQ. We have a joint venture with them for Canadian cannabis, where it's a legal market, to develop a cash-settled financial index, since you can't take physical delivery unless you're licensed. And we'll be continuing to push forward with that on hemp. We think hemp is a more easily commoditized market. It's easier to determine what a standard grade of hemp is, which is an important part of a futures contract. And farmers are generally more familiar with these types of financial tools and see the benefit of them. So we expect that hemp to start trading as a normal commodity long before cannabis. I mean, cannabis has to be legal nationally to get there.
Right, and some key factors we've actually talked about on some previous episodes of Plants to Plants are how, you know, getting towards some form of standardization for the metrics on the commodities, on the biomass, on the crude oil, on some of these other you know, commodity ingredient classifications that we're going to talk about in a bit, is going to be essential to formalizing the market, because you really need to be able to know what's being traded, have an apples to apples trade in order to you know, bring it into a financial model, an exchange model, where a speculator, as you said, which is sometimes a scary word for people to hear the word speculator, but really the speculators in the commodities markets are providing liquidity to the cultivators and to the processors. They're providing capital into the market without that necessitating a physical trade of the goods. So it
and
really,
I think, Emmett, you'll see that really the market and a lot of farmers and processors suffered last summer. They entered into forward contracts with a set price of delivery, with a price of, you know, that they saw in May of maybe $3 to $4 a point per CBD. After the fall harvest, when the prices were dropping below $1, a lot of processors weren't able to fulfill those contracts. A lot of farmers were left with biomass that they couldn't sell. So it created a lot of collateral damage. The second element there is that right now, both processors and producers are suffering from a lack of working capital. Processors who'd like to go into the market and buy biomass at these very, very favorable prices may not have access to capital. And as a result, you know, farmers are left having to either toll or split with processors, and it kind of puts a logjam in the whole market. So being able to provide these financial tools, provide working capital to the processors and the producers, I think it's going to be an important part of the maturing market.
right, because essentially you're taking the financial burden of holding the inventory cost off of the farmer and off the processor and putting it into the hands of traders. And then at the time that the processor actually needs product, they can buy from the market, from the traders who have the ownership over that commodity and on a sort of more on-demand basis, rather than having to have this huge capital base to buy ahead of time and have months and months of capital outlay before they're able to process through that inventory. So that's really useful tool for processors. So
absolutely. Edwin, you want to click forward here? Maybe you can't.
Would you like to take a moment to look at this? I think we pretty much talked through these points. But.
Yeah, let's just go to. I mean, we'll do this quickly. We're commodity data experts. We do have some cultivation and wholesale market experts on the team as well. We publish both spot and futures prices for cannabis, just spot prices for hemp. And the markets we serve buyers and sellers, those supporting production and sale, and investing or assisting others with investing. We've been price reporting since 2015. On the next slide, you'll see that we have over 100 plus price assessments for legal cannabis in the US and Canada. And we're developing, we have 21 indices right now for hemp, which we're expanding into fiber and grain, in addition to the cannabinoids that we've been reporting on to date. We think longer term, the traditional industrial fiber and grain hemp markets are going to be substantially larger than the cannabinoid market as hemp starts penetrating some of the other traditional end markets. And we're seeing some movement in those areas right now that we're beginning to report on. And we'll also be releasing global benchmarks. Hemp is a global commodity, and we're seeing rapid development in Europe and Latin America, and we're actively beginning to collect prices in those regions as well. If we'll take a quick recap of what we all know too well, which is the price trends. over the past 13 months of our reporting. And you'll see here the monthly indices that we publish. We will be moving these to weekly reports. We won't have the full-blown report, but we'll have weekly price assessments. It's impossible at this point to provide daily price assessments. There's not enough activity in the market. There's probably not enough activity right now to report on a weekly basis on biomass sales, which have basically slowed to a complete trickle. But again, these markets will continue to expand. We're anxiously awaiting the FDA rules and regs to help open up the end markets for CBD. We're seeing increased movement in the CBG markets, but you can see that it was a pretty brutal year out there. CBD with biomass down 85%. Flower actually held up the best, not surprisingly. I think the dried flower market surprised everyone this year. Industrial seeds are actually up, and that's just because they haven't had the same heavy supply. Hemp crude oil is down remarkably. So what we need to do is we'll track supply and demand. That's what drives prices. We're seeing right now what the oversupply last year did to the market. Last year we projected that there was 100,000 acres of hemp that was actually successfully planted and harvested and processable. A lot of that's still in the barn. And that was probably more than twice or three times what the end markets were ready to absorb. Coming into this year, I'm going to go to the next slide, Edwin. I think just to get a dramatic representation of the price movement.
Yeah. This an observation that I've been making of the data over this time period that we've had the Hemp Benchmarks data is essentially that the commodities that are considered from the bulk buyer, business to business buyer perspective to be most interchangeable are seeing the greatest price depression, right? So isolate, essentially a kilo of isolate, as long as it's up to a certain purity standard, is interchangeable with any kilo of isolate, right? So we've seen strong depression in that price. Biomass, although it's highly variable, has seen pretty much across the board price suppression just because of oversupply and because it can more or less be treated as equivalent across the board. Distillate, interestingly, has held price a little bit better. Still strong depression of price, but it's held price a little bit better than the other individual ingredient commodities. I wonder, I would speculate that maybe that's because some isolate quality, some high quality distillate, I should say, some high quality distillate has been able to command a higher price because of existing demand for distillate that has very specific characteristics and has perhaps drugged that price point up higher on the mean by having certain prices higher. But we can look at that data further down.
I think when we look, and we publish a range of prices that we collect, we throw out outliers through our data refinery to clean the data. And there is a wide variation in the pricing, and a lot of that's based on geography. Where are you? Where you are. The quality of the crude, for example. I mean, crude can vary dramatically. I think, at some point we'll be breaking it down to raw CBD content to make up for the variation in concentration in the crude. And then it's also the needs of the buyer and seller. We saw some extremely depressed pricing this fall with farmers who were price insensitive. They just wanted to move their biomass. We see certified organic products holding up better. We'll be able to report on that as we collect statistically significant data on it. But in the Northeast, and I'm back here in the Northeast, certified organic full spectrum distillate and THC distillate, THC free, has held up fairly well. And we're beginning to, and I think THC free has really held up the best across the country. And I think that's probably because of demand. I think the European market in particular is directed towards THC-free distillate.
Right, and we'll take a look at some of the, some of the supply side data for that later on in the presentation as well. So maybe we can move on to this extraction survey where we start to get into...
Before we get into extraction, let's talk a little bit about supply for this year. We've been tracking with the state departments of agriculture, the permitted acreage across the country coming into this season. And what we're seeing is that there are dramatic reductions in permitted acreage in the major, more mature markets. Montana, which had 45,000 acres permitted last year, only has 11,000 acres permitted this year, and 85% of that is for fiber and grain. So only 15% for cannabinoids, which is a dramatic reduction. It looks like Oregon's going to have half of the permitted acreage. North Carolina's probably about half. So in these, Kentucky's reduced, Tennessee has less permitted acreage. Last year, we saw that only half of the permitted acreage was actually planted. And we're hearing similar reports from the field this year, with farmers just stepping back. Part of it's COVID related, part of it's capital related. We don't see a logjam with buying seeds. So the farmers can get in the fields if they want to, but we're seeing a general pullback. So we're expecting the supply this year to be a little bit muted. Hopefully the demand will continue to pick up. There is a lot of biomass still in the barns, and I think that may end up being used for bedding. It's probably fairly degraded at this point unless somebody's been keeping it refrigerated for the past month. So hopefully we'll get a little bit more stability next year. Commodities typically trade towards the marginal cost of production. I think we've seen that a hell of a lot of farmers lost money last year. Prices were below the cost of production. 94% of farmers in some states reported losing money. And that's why people exit the markets.
Right, so also getting further and further pushed towards high efficiency cultivation methodologies. There's been a little bit of a trend even in the bulk biomass hemp market towards a more lingering approaches from the outdoor cannabis markets. So some more use of nutrients that are not bought in true agricultural bulk quantities. So you're getting, some of these fertilizer approaches that have a relatively high cost, manicuring of the plants that we've seen in some markets that are just very labor intensive. So would you say it's fair to think that the production methodologies in the fields are likely to change towards more of a broad acre crop standard cultivation method?
Well, no doubt about it. On the industrial fiber and grain side, it's going to be a typical row crop. Obviously, PCR, phytocannabinoid, is going to be more labor intensive. But we saw a wide, and we've been tracking production costs, but we can't really report on it yet. We don't have enough data. It's been moving very quickly. But we saw some farmers able to deliver 1,500 pounds an acre at $7,500 an acre. Others were up at 15,000. So there was a variety based on farming techniques, technology, and infrastructure. We've also seen, and you can probably speak to this as well, on the processing side, the cost of producing a full spectrum distillate with a lower input cost of biomass and the more efficient processing capabilities has brought the cost of production of a kilo of full spectrum or broad spectrum distillate down quite a bit over the past 12 months. And I think that's why, even though we've seen dramatic compression in prices, at $1,500 a kilo or $12.50 a kilo for full spectrum distillate, we expect that still has a reasonable margin built into it for most processors. So I think we are seeing efficiencies for both producers and processors. And again, we expect long term that, like typical commodities, these will trade at a marginal cost of production, which will provide enough of a margin to keep folks into the business and make a decent living.
Right. All right. Well, let's talk about capacities here, because what one big question that hasn't quite been answered in the market, and of course will continue to develop, especially we're hoping there might be a spike in demand if the FDA makes a final ruling on inclusion of hemp extracts as a food ingredient. But you know, a question that I always come up against is supply and demand, how are they in relation to each other right now, and what we're going to see in the future? What can we plan on as far as demand-driven growth versus the price volatility just being high margins crushing down to lower margins as we approach, you know, marginal cost of production. So I'm thinking we might get some interesting conclusions out of this.
You know, again, there's a lack of transparency and data on a lot of this, particularly on the CBD side, the demand side. When we took our look at demand last year, and we came up with between 1.2 and 1.5 billion dollar retail market for CBD, the major CBD companies aggregating their revenues and extrapolating their market share. So we came in with about a 1.2 to 1.5 billion dollar number. The range of projections was between 800,000 and 5 billion, with one $13 billion outlier that was reported in Forbes. Folks have said that they expect the CBD market to be $22 billion in 2022. You know, that's almost seems like an impossibility at this point, but I think that's what drove this green rush to some degree. These projections about, you know, these markets growing at 300, 400, 500% per year.
Well, I think there's definitely the possibility that we could continue to see that growth globally, especially as distribution of finished goods reaches into untapped markets. I'm thinking especially in Asia, there's some big markets that are relatively under-tapped at this point due to distribution considerations and also regulatory considerations. You know, if we see uptick in China demand or demand in India and Pakistan potentially, that could continue to drive substantial growth.
They've used you know, cannabinoids as medicine for thousands of years, so it wouldn't be unexpected for those markets to develop. One metric that I look at is the average spend on dietary supplements is $500 a year. There have been surveys that say that 10% of adult U.S. citizens have used or use CBD. So that's 25 million people. If they're doing $500 a year, that's $12.5 billion market just in the U.S. So there is significant potential. We just have, as an industry, have to realize it, and the regulators haven't been helping with the delays in promulgating the regulations.
Well, let's you know, as we know, everybody's waiting on bated breath for either the legislature to come through and make a clear pathway to sell these ingredients either through food or nutritional supplements, or for the FDA to finally come out with final rulings on the GRAS, generally regarded as safe status of the CBD extract or CBD as an isolated ingredient. But let's maybe dive into what we do know now, which is a bit more about what the actual capacity of processing is in the market.
What drove us here to start collecting the data on extraction capacity was that we heard in the fall, as farmers were bringing in their harvest, that there was a bottleneck in processing capacity. Now, it turns out, I think there was more of a bottleneck in capital than in capacity. We just completed a survey in May where we had over 400 respondents, 250 of whom were actively operating processing facilities. We didn't build the additional data that we've collected into the survey data. We didn't want to commingle them, but we have also built out our own database of an additional 150 extractors, and we have extraction capacity for about 100 of those that we've directly confirmed by talking to the processors. So this is indicative of what folks are doing and how they're doing it, but it doesn't really capture the full capacity of the market, which we've calculated has well over 200 million tons of processing capacity. You know, if we,
what
if we generated
time
100,000 acres with 1,000 pounds per acre and 100 million tons that last year, that's still 2 times the capacity. Now, it's not always where you need it. There are regional bottlenecks. We do see major, in our heat map, we see major extraction capacity where you would expect it. Colorado, Oregon, Kentucky, and South Carolina is especially well because that's a large producer. And then there are a lot of markets where they don't have any processing capacity at all. When it's clear that hemp biomass can be moved in interstate commerce, and there's still some gray areas there, although I think most people are doing it fairly comfortably, that regional differentiation won't matter much. But what we did find from our survey is that over 85% of the operators produce crude oil from the biomass. Daily capacity was fairly evenly distributed, but almost 45% were processing a maximum of 500 pounds of biomass a day, or had the capacity to. It didn't mean that they were actually doing it. We know that a lot of facilities are running at less than capacity. Dozens have started producing sanitizer. Some have furloughed employees, and some have just really cap back their operations. And we can see really a lot of smaller producers and a few giants, a lot of whom run into difficulty this year with their working capital and capital expenditure requirements.
And this is really interesting to me in particular, that this is such a flat curve, you know, that we're seeing such an even distribution across the different scales of processors. In particular, you know, we would kind of expect to see something more linear down with relatively few producers at the more than 5,000 pounds of production capacity.
We saw a tremendous amount of capital invested in cannabinoid processing. In Kentucky, for example, in 2018, there was $20 million invested. In 2019, there was $200 million invested. And I think, you know, we know what happened with Gen Ken and Elemental. They're just way overexpanded for today's market. And the assets will be, Gen Ken will be restructured. They've restructured their debt. The lender's taking control. It will continue to operate. They may not finish the Mayfield facility. One other fact that we did see fairly graphically here is over 50%, 60% of the processing method is ethanol. Most of that is cryoethanol, although we didn't get a breakdown between cryo and warm. It'd be interesting to see which part of the market's growing faster, ethanol or CO2. We're seeing, just by looking at our reporting and the folks that we're talking to, CO2 seems to be becoming a bit more popular and creeping up on ethanol. I think ethanol is more of a traditional technology. And then we're seeing some of the larger facilities using heptane and other processes. And these are like the Vibin facility in Michigan City, Indiana, which is a repositioned wheat germ oil extraction facility.
Right, yeah, so I think that a big chunk of that other section there is probably hexane. There's probably a little bit of water-based extraction basis in there. But yeah, hexane, which isn't represented on this graph, probably is a sizable chunk of that other, I would imagine. Although at this point, there's probably relatively few number of facilities
They're just
that are processing. They're just the larger end.
Yeah.
And I would say
I think you're right, Emmett. We tried to keep it so people could fill out the survey quickly. So other was a big category. If we talked, we probably would have hexane as another box.
Right, and the same, of course, goes for the daily input capacity. Maybe we'd see more of a gradual taper if there were more, you know, above 5,000 pounds. We do hear some processors saying as high as 50,000 up to 100,000 pounds of processing capacity. Again, mainly retrofitted existing facilities from other industries that, such as wheat germ or some food oils manufacturing. So
yeah, there's a chili oil facility in New Mexico that will run hemp if they have an order.
Right.
And there, of course, there's some hop processors are perfectly happy to process hemp as well with industrial sized facilities.
Yes, absolutely. Aware of one large CO2 facility in Washington doing that. Now, across the board, what we do hear from those facilities is that they haven't quite been fully optimized yet. So we're seeing potentially, in some cases, lower yields per cannabinoid percentage in biomass, and also potentially lower concentration of cannabinoids in the crude from some of these processes. But they're
some of them do have an additional. I'm sorry. Some of them, they have the additional risk if they have a continuous process, and you're cleaning the facility out between running different products through it. If you have a glitch, you can ruin a lot of biomass.
Yeah, they have high risk if you have any sort of failures in a very large system. While obviously the cost of that loss is high. Something interesting to note about that in particular is that right now, like you said, there's some facilities that are running hemp in only some time and running other products at other times. That's very irregular, I would think, for most food commodity production markets. You would typically see primarily one type of biomass, one type of commodity food product going into a processing facility, and one type of ingredient coming out. So what we haven't quite seen yet, at least anecdotally, is facilities completely switching over and focusing solely on large capacity hemp throughput, except for maybe 2 or 3 facilities out there that we're aware of that have made it.
I think BioBin would be, a leading example of that. They can process 4 million pounds of biomass in a converted wheat germ facility.
And that's an annual number.
They have another one ready to go.
Yeah. And that's an annual number, is that right?
Yeah, 40 million pounds.
Yep. So those are big numbers, and they're sure to improve their process over time. So something to be aware of is entering the market. We'll of course be looking to see this survey done more times as the years go on to see how this data develops. Anecdotally, though, we could say pretty confidently that we're going to see more and more bias towards the high end of the scale for commodity production of crude oil.
One of the mantras in the commodity markets is if you're not a low-cost producer, you're not going to be in business for long. It's just the way things are. If I was talking to a producer today before I planted hemp, I'd make sure I knew where I was going to sell it. And if I was a processor or investing in processing equipment, I would make sure that we were going to be a very competitive, low-cost producer. Now, there are areas, and I think there are a lot of smaller processors who are not going to be low-cost, but they're developing what I would call a craft versus a commodity product. It may have very strong local sales channels. It may be certified organic. There'll be a narrative there where the farmer and the processor basically become part of the story, and that's what the consumer is buying. So, I don't think you have to be an industrial scale, huge $60, $50 million facility to find your niche in the market. Actually, we're seeing in today's market that some of the smaller, and I wouldn't call them craft, but some of the smaller producers who aren't burdened with a heavy debt load or heavy working capital and have flexibility and have kind of right size for their market, and they have sales channels, are being very successful.
Yeah, so securing an offloading channel upfront, knowing where you're going to put your ingredients, where you're going to sell them. Is it your own products? Do you have a relationship with an end consumer brand that's going to buy all your oil if you can guarantee a certain quality? Really key things to forecasting, not just assuming that this is a pure commodity market and you're going to be able to use those, use those traders to offload product like in other commodity markets. You might, at least not yet.
I think people's Perspectives have developed over the past 2 years as the green rush has come and gone. And I think processors now are, and vertically integrated companies, are really focused on the end markets and developing the sales channels and looking at international markets. I think with the rush going on, it was let's produce it, let's process it, and now it's really turning to the most important component of the supply chain, and that is who's going to buy it and where are we going to sell it.
Great. All right, well, maybe we can move on into some of these specific ingredient data.
You know, it's interesting because I think the isolate market has obviously collapsed, and there've been it's well below the cost of production. And even crude today, you can probably buy it cheaper than you can make it in many cases, just because of the inventory levels that have built up at some of the major processors. Isolate, we don't know exactly what created the crater. Obviously, oversupply. There are, I think, validated reports that there were imports of isolate, some of it synthetic from China. And people were also building very large inventories of isolate. And isolate may be very useful as a pharma, as a molecule, but I think most of the market is more interested in the full spectrum distillate or THC distillate that has the other terpenes and some of the other cannabinoids. We think CBG, CBN, CBA are all going to become important components as we move through. Right now, CBD is the driver. We don't want to create more confusion with the consumer. It's already confusing enough, but we do need research and education to demonstrate efficacy for the other cannabinoids to help those markets develop. But you will see here that over 70% of our respondents, so basically 200 of the 250 active respondents, are producing both full or spectrum.
Yeah, so you're breaking up. You're breaking up there a little bit, Ian.
Okay.
So I guess I'd like to reiterate what you just said, which is that, and this is surprising to me, is that a relatively high percentage of the processors that have been interviewed for gathering this data on the survey do produce distillate in addition to crude oil. So the distillate capacity, now what this doesn't necessarily show is the relationship between crude oil capacity and distillation capacity. We assume that in a lot of cases, probably distillation capacity is lagging behind crude oil production capacity. But still, there's a good amount of distillation capacity. It's almost viewed by many as an essential component of their processing facility.
I think that's absolutely right. Actually, some of the major distillation processes are just buying crude from other places. They don't want to bring the biomass to their facility. It's a lot easier to keep a clean shop if you're processing crude in the distillate. So, you know, we see it on both ends, but clearly most people won't have the capability of taking crude to distillate.
Unfortunately, breaking up there a little bit again, but
maybe my internet is weak. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. You're sounding pretty good now. But yes, you know, like he was saying, not some facilities just dedicated to distillate, just dedicated to post-processing, keeping crude oil production at arm's length. I think based on what we talked about earlier, it's fair to say that crude oil price over the span of a few years is likely to have the potential to come back up, or at least to stabilize as the number of fire sales of crude oil at or below cost tapers off and the business sort of resumes a more normal supply-demand relationship. But as it is right now, the post-processors that are dedicated to buying crude oil from outside and just distilling it, just post-processing it into other value-added ingredients may have an advantage in the current market.
I think that's right, Emmett. We think that we're burning off substantial inventories of crude. 14,000 kilos of crude that they want to liquidate to generate cash. And we're seeing that across the board. I mean, when people are looking to buy crude, and they can maybe buy less than $200 a kilo, like we're seeing in the market. You have to be a pretty desperate seller.
So in an effort to try and improve the connection, I may drop off video feed here to try and see if that gives you a better bandwidth, Ian. But yeah, you were mentioning the Gencana case where they have, I believe it's 14,000 kilograms of crude. Is that right?
That's the reports we heard. We didn't see it in the bankruptcy filings. We just heard that from observers.
Okay. So, large on-hand capacity of crude. So obviously you're seeing some of these large companies that expected were expecting a higher price point in the market, built their financial markets on that, perhaps overbuilt capacity or didn't achieve a really low cost per unit capacity. And so now have a large buildup of crude that was relatively higher expenditure to produce for them. So, now going into some of these financial proceedings, bankruptcy, receivership, et cetera, and therefore introducing a high volume of crude at or below cost into the market. So that's probably depressing market prices and giving an advantage to those that can soak up that excess capacity and produce a value-added product. Distillate, you're seeing here a few producers out there. I'm actually surprised here again that you're looking at more than 5% of the market can produce 10,000 kilograms of distillate this is per month. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, so there are some very large distillation capacity producers out there. Some of these again could be some of these plants that have switched over from other ingredients, wheat germ oil, et cetera, that have more capacity than they may be using per month. But they are claiming here, what is your monthly production of full broad spectrum distillate in kilograms? That gives you an idea. 10,000 kilograms per month is a target that is being hit out there in the market. So something to consider for those that are forming their new business or planning on scaling their business up, want to know what the scale of competition is. It can be quite large.
Yeah. Is my audio working again, Emmett?
It is, yes, it is.
Okay.
So perhaps we'll move on to the next slide. Big, very important piece of the market right now, THC remediation. Ian, what can you see in the market?
What we're seeing generally is that THC or THC-free distillate is a very popular product. Athletes, truck drivers, anybody who may be tested wants to make sure that their product is THC-free. The European market seems to have a very clear preference for THC-free distillate. And we're seeing that 45% of the folks we talked to said that their facility could perform THC remediation, which is surprising to me because running around, we see a lot of folks who don't have that capability and who outsource the THC remediation almost to order. If they have an order with a client who wants THC free, they take it through the remediation. Otherwise, they keep the full spectrum. And you can see that HPLC is the most popular form of remediation. And again, there are a couple of, more than 15% have significant remediation capacity.
So you're seeing here, more than 1,000 kilograms per month. Again, this is just far below what the distillation capacity or any other production capacity is in the market. Strong demand for this product category. But what we know from the equipment side is that this is a very high cost per unit capacity equipment set to be able to perform this THC remediation chromatography as it's done right now. We do see out in the market there are some alternative methodologies that are not chromatography that could have a big impact in the market. We're tracking those quite closely. and doing research and development ourselves to see if there are some viable alternative pathways. But as long as these chromatography solutions are the primary go-to solution, it is a high cost of entry, so a high barrier to entry on this, but the demand is strong. And it seems, if I'm not wrong, that the pricing on this has held quite a bit more stable than the other ingredient product categories, although it has gone down, tracking with the cost of the crude input material as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. It has held up better than others, and it seems to have a growing demand. I think the processors are getting smarter, and the brands are getting smarter about developing their end markets. They're going to sports conferences, they're bringing on sports ambassadors and advisors. I think from what you hear, almost every senior professional golfer is using CBD, and most of them are using THC free. And their stories of Roy McIlroy and some of the other guys who, such incredible stress on their bodies are making sure that they have THC free product to use.
Right. Yeah. So that push from the athletes of the world, obviously very crucial influencers in the market. So they're going to drive consumer adoption. Also, again, this concerns about drug testing. Although there is conflicting reports out there, there may be a individual genetic predisposition, I've heard, as to whether CBD may, in some cases, or other minor cannabinoids may, in some cases, actually cause certain individuals to fail a drug test initially. Unclear on that. There's been no official statements from the drug testing companies themselves that I've seen as to whether this is the case or not. So again, something to be tracking, but certainly from a popular perspective and effectively from the athlete's position, who are professional athletes or retired athletes using these solutions, they are successfully using them in their own practice. So that's likely to drive consumer fitness products trends.
We've all seen Gronk come up with his CBD brand. Isaiah Thomas is on one now. But we did hear direct reports from a sports doctor from one of the more popular NFL football teams who said he had every one of his players on CBD.
Yep. So the current professional athletes are starting to adopt, and that will likely trickle down to the amateur athlete markets as well. So if THC free remains the primary go-to ingredient for them, that is going to likely see proportionally strong growth out there for the demand from an ingredient side and from an end consumer product side. So one to track with tightly, certainly. And also,
go ahead.
Just going to say, so keep track of the technology. We're keeping track of the technology right now. We work with vendors, multiple vendors out there that provide this solution. We think that there could, in the next 12 to 18 months, be a big potential technology surge with lower cost solutions for achieving THC remediation. So do be tracking that as you develop your business. But it seems like a relatively safe, as compared to some of the other ingredient categories, relatively safe ingredient post-processing capacity to build right now, as the demand does seem steady.
Excellent. Should we go to the next slide? I think we've, and this is an area where we're developing data. We're trying to work with some of the software companies that collect this type of cost data. And we're doing it both for producers and processors. What we do know is that average, although people like to think that it's higher. It typically may not be. But we think farmers probably need to make at least $1 to $1.25 a point to be profitable. We estimated that there was between 500 and 700 million dollars of losses in the field last year. Now we'll be collecting data over the next year and reporting on the cost of production of the various different processing methods, and hopefully that'll give people insight into what the production costs are and what the lowest level of pricing that they're prepared to work with.
Yep, so a little hard to hear you in this section, but I think I can take a whack at reiterating here. You know, at $1 per percentage point of CBD, you know, acre on average, of course, very regionally dependent, could generate $10,000 of revenue. Unfortunately, at this point, you're seeing in the field prices per percentage point as low as 30 cents, 20 cents out in the field. So there are a lot of farmers selling below production cost, and that there are some low cost producers out there in the market that are able to still be profitable. But from the farming side, focusing on bringing down cost of production is going to be very essential. And we may, in this season, just see some regions start to outshine others. For example, I've seen efforts in Arizona being relatively unsuccessful. Of course, the traditional cultivation areas in Kentucky, Oregon, and Washington to a lesser extent are being successful. Montana, good market, although they had difficulties getting their product to market. So we're going to see this continue to evolve, but we may potentially see an uptick in the price per pound of biomass this next year, 2021, as there will be less production.
I think that processors who are trying to maintain strong, consistent relationships with their suppliers and producers, and they're trying to maintain pricing above $1 for their farmers. You know, $1.15 to $1.25 seems to be a stable price.
Right. So just to reiterate there, the relationship between processors and producers, obviously on the surface level, maybe these strong price depression of the price of biomass out there may appear to benefit the processors. Right now, though, it is largely a toll processing market. So of course, the farmers not hitting a point where they are profitable on their biomass are not likely to purchase toll processing services. And so it is actually potentially beneficial for the processors out there to hold the price higher so that the farms stay viable and so that their supply and quality supply in particular doesn't collapse as farmers exit the market. So tight relationships between processors and farmers really, even if it is at an apparently higher cost due to higher cost of materials, if that helps those farmers stay in business and produce a consistent quality and volume of supply, could actually benefit both businesses quite strongly. And we do see some co-op models. There's some players out there like White Buffalo and others that have a tighter relationship with their growers, that they're trying their best to at least keep the growers growing so that they have good, solid, long-term relationships, 5-year plan of maintaining the relationships between grower and processor. So something to track here.
Should we do a little Q&A?
Yeah, great. And if you can go ahead and go to the last slide there, Edwin. So yeah, a good chance to go to hempbenchmarks.com. We are going to have some question and answers right now, but this is really an essential data service to be a subscriber to if you're a processor thinking of building a processing plant. Know what the market looks like, track month to month, and make good forecasting on what your actual sale price is going to be.
And we do collect a fair percentage of our data from our price contributor network. We provide our price contributors with a discounted subscription, some custom analytics, and some access to our team. We've had over 200 processors, primarily processors and producers, express an interest in becoming a member of our network. We've brought on a good percentage of those. Not all of them have prices every month, depending upon where they are in the supply chain, but it's a good way for us to build out our prices. We'd like to be able to report on regional prices. We'd like to be able to report on the premium for certified organic product. To do that, we need to get as much data as possible. We're also working with software companies and other folks who are collecting data as part of providing an ERP or some other software tools to producers and processors.
Right, and this is a key piece of collaboration in the market. Is if we want to see the whole market grow and be and stabilize and have good solid financial projections leading to a solid base of processing capacity that both the end buyers and the farmers can rely on, and it's important that some degree of anonymized data sharing does happen. You see this across the board in agricultural markets. It's really an essential part of formalizing agricultural markets and just commodity markets across the board. So definitely encourage everyone, if you can, please contribute to Hemp Benchmarks and improve this data set. The more contributors there are, the more accurate it is. The more stable the market is going to be, the faster it's going to be able to get to a stable point where profit margins are predictable and we can have more traditional access to financial services. A very essential part of the development. Encourage everyone, please send questions and answers into the Q&A or chat modules on Zoom right now. I'm sure Ian would love to dive in to anything that you'd like to bring up. I did see one question out there, which is how do you find the recordings of this and other presentations on Plants to Plants? You can look up Sci-Fi Systems, SCIPHY Systems on YouTube, and that will link you to Plants to Plants, or just search Plants to Plants in YouTube. You should be able to find all of our back episodes. Well, while we're waiting for some additional questions to come in, here's another question for you, Ian. How do you plan on finding a way to build the confidence in the providers of these commodity exchanges services in the hemp market? You mentioned that you need a couple of years, maybe 3 years of steady hemp pricing data. Are there other things that players in the market, the processors, agricultural producers, or even producers of end user goods can do to try and encourage the formalization of the market and gain access to those?
Absolutely. What we're trying to do now is help build the knowledge base of some of these major exchanges with the market and the market participants. So we are introducing a couple of the exchanges to some of the major players, particularly those that have a commodity type of experience, and there are a lot of folks in the market that have it. And we're also bringing in the investment firms, trading firms that have expressed an interest in trading both cannabis and hemp as a commodity. A number of our subscribers are hedge funds or investment firms They track the commodity at some level to get insight into the equity markets where there is active trading today. So if you're looking to invest in a multi-state cannabis operator, you're going to want to know what the relative strength of the pricing is in the markets the MSO is participating in. I think we were way ahead on the Canadian market on the oversupply there, and which has driven a 70, 80, 90% loss in equity value and a tremendous number of write-downs. So part of it is just helping convince them about the opportunity. A number of the major markets see hemp and cannabis as the next large emerging commodity. Now that crypto's kind of had its takeoff. The exchanges have done very well on crypto. They're looking for the next thing. And when you look at the combined potential size of the legal cannabis and hemp markets, particularly as cannabis begins to legalize on medical or recreational level around the world, you can just see that it's an opportunity that they don't want to ignore. There's going to be, trillions of dollars in those markets ultimately. And sometimes the first mover never loses their advantage. So they're trying to get smart, and we're trying to help them get smart and introducing the folks to convince them that this is where they want to spend their time and money. And I think we're making good progress with them.
Well, please, I see we still have a lot of participants in here. Please do ask questions. In the meantime, I think one thing that it would be helpful for some of our viewers to better understand is actually how does a future function, and like in the hemp market in particular, how could you see a future, from the perspective of the farmer, from the perspective of the processor, how would a future contract actually work in the market? And then what do you think you could predict as the effect on market pricing after the commodity market actually opens and is formalized?
Well, a future contract is the opportunity to buy a commodity at a certain time at a certain price. And the advantage is that it puts it sets your price. You can hedge with a futures contract. So if you sell it for less, at least you're protected, like an option. Or the advantage is it enables farmers to sell their crops forward and get working capital from the market. So I think that the biggest advantage for producers and processors is access to capital and access to working capital. For the speculators and the investors, it just gives them the opportunity to hedge if they might have an equity position they want to hedge, just like a gold producer might do with a gold ETF. So
from the farmer's perspective, it would be essentially a portion of the price that the farmer sets a price ahead of the harvest and agrees with a buyer, a trader, to a set price to sell the commodity at the date of harvest, and then takes a portion of capital up front in exchange for setting that price. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what an exchange brings, a real formal exchange, is the ability to clear and settle those trades. Right now, there are a number of hemp and cannabis focused exchanges, but they don't help manage counterparty risk. What if the guy that you're selling to fails or doesn't have the financial capability of following through with the trade? You're left with a busted trade. And the real exchanges take that risk out of the equation. They vet their buyers and sellers. And in some cases, they balance the accounts out every day based on the value of the underlying commodity. Well, we're not going to get there for a long time, but if we can get to where we have strong weekly pricing, I think we can create an active exchange.
Great. And what do you, one thing that I sort of have been predicting for some time is that, right now we have a lot of different varietals being planted we have a lot of variation, not only in the concentration of the cannabinoids on a per harvest basis, but also the concentration of other compounds in the plant that may not be cannabinoids, but may have impacts on the processing, the process itself. How much standardization do you think is needed before these, exchange type trading platforms are able to really deal with the market? Is there going to need to be a fewer number of varietals in the field, or are those exchanges going to be able to take a relatively high amount of variability into account, assuming that there are, certificates of analysis available for each harvest?
Well, the issue we had in trying to commoditize cannabis is that people are strain focused. Blue Dream, Girl Scout cookies, whatever the strain of the day is. It was very difficult for people to create what they might consider a standard grade. It's going to be easier with the hemp side, and really the standard grade is just a peg that a product will trade around. So if the standard grade is 10% CBD and you come in with a 14% CBD biomass, you're going to get a premium to the standard. If you come in with 6, there's going to be a discount. That will be able to work its way out. I do think that the genetics will become more defined. I think there'll be fewer of them. I think we're still in the experimentation phase. But I think they're going to be clear winners. I've just come across a Thc Free Cbg Seed. That could be a game changer from a processing perspective, producing and processing. When the USDA came out with their total THC test, which I think was a surprise to many people in the market, it created a situation where many of the new high CBD cannabinoid-rich strains are hot. A large majority of them will be hot when you look at total THC, and that's going to force some genetic work. Monsanto's going to come up with a THC-free CBD seed, and they'll patent it, and there you go.
Yeah, we'll see if it's the traditional giants or if some of these upstart genetics breeders will come up with something new and exciting. One thing that you have brought up is this, idea of other cannabinoids coming into the market, and how, if you just look at the overall market and the growth in the pricing curves for CBG in particular, which I think is the one you have best indexed, do you think it is likely that those minor cannabinoids have a good value proposition in the market, or is it does the experience with CBG support that having cultivators and processors focus on producing those other compounds outside of CBD?
I think there may be an initial premium like we've seen with CBG, which is quickly disappearing. We've heard and we've seen from some of the major seed producers that they're selling a lot more CBG seeds this year in percentage of proportion to CBD. Can the market absorb it? I mean, those of us who live and breathe hemp and the cannabinoids know about CBG, but does your general consumer? We have so much work to do to educate consumers and learn ourselves and research ourselves the efficacy of CBD. Clearly CBG, CBN have some distinctive characteristics that will make them more effective for treating different conditions. But we got a lot of research to do and a lot of education before consumers are going to be able to differentiate between the cannabinoids.
Right, absolutely. That would be, so there is caution there, much like any other new ingredient. It's probably important to know who is focusing on selling the end consumer product, including that ingredient. If you can establish a relationship with someone that's going to market CBG for a specific end use case or specific product, then may be worth pushing in that direction. but also some caution is likely worth having, because the market as it is right now knows CBD quite well, but the minor cannabinoids are less well known.
And CBG had such a tremendous premium coming into this season, and we knew people who focused their production on CBG, and they created a beautiful product. They've had a hard time moving it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so slow, maybe higher price point, lower volume.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. I think there is a question here. What % of the American hemp farmers are growing for fiber? Do you expect American markets to have hemp fiber for twine and textiles?
Basically, last year it looked like about 90% of the production was for CBD in most states. We think that's changing, and we think it will continue to change over the coming years. I wouldn't be surprised in 3 or 4 years if fiber and grains a larger percentage of the market than cannabinoids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but as it is right now, total market still biased towards cannabinoid production.
And if you look at, there was probably, I don't know, maybe $500, $600, $700 million invested in CBD processing and extraction last year. I mean, if there was 200 million in Kentucky alone, it implies that, $400 or $500 million worth of investment. There was probably less than $50 million of investment in other more traditional processing methods or facilities.
Mm-hmm. One interesting note. Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say, we do know that some of the major industrial equipment manufacturers who do pulp and paper and textiles and other types of markets are investing now in developing processes for natural plant substitution for petroleum-based or synthetic products. I think everybody's focused on biodegradable, eliminating the plastic stream. We know that hemp could be very effective there, but we have to be able to do it at scale in a cost-effective manner, and that's going to take some engineering, some innovation, and people are working at it. But we're really in the early days there. There's been so much focus on extraction, but I think investment's beginning to swing the other direction.
Mm-hmm. And I can say that we have seen some interesting innovations and indications from the textiles industry in more adoption of hemp. I know that there was some testing done with regards to some major blue jeans manufacturers on going back to incorporating hemp fiber in their blends. We're aware of some facilities out there that have been successful at making a very soft hemp fiber for textile applications in the United States. So there seems to be some growing interest in that market. Also, a major market to track for fiber utilization seems to be Montana. They certainly, out of all the other markets, seem to have planted more proportionally for fiber and seed than any of the other markets. Last point to make on the fiber side is that we do see some forward progress right now, some announcements on testing moving forward to validate the use of hempcrete as a standard building material in the United States. So there is some standards organizations that are moving forward with doing the testing to allow that to be a standard use rather than right now it has to go through essentially a custom or irregular building material permitting process similar to something like a cob home. In the future, though, it seems the trend is towards, much like it is in the UK and other places in Europe, hempcrete, which includes a relatively large percentage of hemp fiber, as becoming a normalized building material in the United States and in other markets internationally. So
yeah, I think we're going to see good progress on the non-woven fiber side. I think there's going to be some good developments there. The issue we have is to get a major blue jean manufacturer or anybody else to change their supply chain, you need a large volume, consistent, reliable, and cost competitive supplier, which generally means fairly scaled facilities. To get the investment you need to build a scaled facility, you typically have to go through a pilot project to demonstrate the parameters of the processing. Then you have a small commercial scale plant before you build out the large commercial plant. So it's an evolution. I did a lot of work in the pulp and paper industry. We know that hemp is can be a very good fiber for pulp, and it's a lot more productive than trees in creating cellulose. But the hemp manufacturers just lost the technology to process hemp on the front end to convert some of these older pulp mills to be fibered with hemp. But I think they're beginning to catch up. Andritz, which is a major pulp and paper equipment manufacturers, now warranting and producing a refiner for hemp-based medium density fiberboard, stronger than oak, which is potentially a very large market. And you know, when those major equipment guys come in, they can come in at scale. They can warrant their equipment, and they can set performance guarantees so a buyer can be confident that the machine's going to produce what they say it's going to produce.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. So a very interesting market segment, and that's very likely it will grow domestically. Certainly internationally, there is already a more established fiber producers, especially in China and some other Asian markets and in Eastern Europe. There's already fairly well-established hemp fiber cultivation. So in the US, it does not have the sort of first-to-market advantage that it may have with the CBD hemp market for textiles. But at the same time, American innovation certainly is taking an interest and taking a hard look at this. If you are interested specifically in hemp fiber production for textiles, if you're investors or representing a group that has an interest in that segment, we may have an interesting opportunity for you. So, you know, please do reach out. You can find me at emmett.m@scifisystems.com, or just go through our website to our standard contact form, and feel free to reach out. We might be able to put you in touch with some folks that have done some very interesting proof of concept work on the ground already. So, okay, starting my video here. It does seem to be about time for us to wrap up. Ian, I want to thank you so much for coming on, for sharing this data. I believe we are some of the first folks to see this very exciting extraction capacity data in the field. Really an honor to have you on, and I know we will be tracking you and Hemp Benchmarks on into the future and continuing to refer our clients to you as an essential part of business development.
Thank you so much, Emmett. It's a pleasure speaking with you and being able to tap into your knowledge base. You've obviously been thinking about this hard for a long time.
Absolutely. Years in the making. All right. And thank you, everyone. Please do join us next Thursday for our conversation with Stephen Fuhrer, a longtime operator in the market who has gone through the development cycle for a processing plant, who has some real in-the-field experience, both from brokering, buying, selling, and business consulting for those who have both extraction capacity and biomass production capacity. So you can find information on the Sci-Fi Systems website or Instagram for information on that next presentation. And that will again be Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific time. You can use the same login information to access this next week. Otherwise, please register at our website. Once again, Ian, thank you for the time, and we look forward to potentially having you on in future seasons as we get.
Appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it. And thanks for the participants for ringing in.
All right.
Good luck, everyone.
Best of luck.